Welcome back, everybody. I hope you got your snacks. These are going to be the hardcore IBO nerds. Thank you for staying. This is going to be our uplifting panel. This one is all about information and power, and it's followed by a free cocktail party, which, based on your stalwart staying power, you are more than entitled to. And after last week, we are all in need of. But I want to start by simply reiterating what some of the other speakers have said, which is that it has been a genuine honor and pleasure to be able to join this little journey with my friend and now boss, Louisa Chafee, the director of IBO.
Thank you, Marla. And I'm standing up mostly because that way I'm definitely going to stay awake. I want to thank our esteemed panel and all of you ultramarathoners. The point of this panel is to really talk about data and the power of data. So I'm going to do a couple opening remarks and then go through the panel. Fundamentally, the point of our city charter is to empower New Yorkers to effectively participate in local government. Nothing is more central to that goal than access to information. The creation of the IBO was relevant to this goal, but as were many other reforms in the 1989 charter, such as the Citywide Administrative Procedures Act, known as CAPA, a really exciting thing. Or even the attempt in the budget section to require that every appropriation is described in a way that allows the public to really see and understand how city programs are paid for. That's the UA conversation that's happened at various times today. More than any other single piece of the charter, to really look at government transparency and access to data, we should start by recognizing how profoundly our information environment has changed since 1989. Back then, personal desktop computers were just starting to show up. Key staffers had to carry pagers to stay in touch. Key ones, not the rest. If you needed to communicate from the field, you had to carry quarters and find phone booths. A handful of folks had two-way car radios or car phones. In fact, there's a famous story as the charter was evolving that one of the critical attorneys called from the slopes in Utah. So that was like transformative, that they found a payphone on a ski slope, which is, to us, you just turn on your cell phone. 89 was before cell phones, before laptops, before AOL or even Google. Paper was king and recycling was just getting started. So with that backdrop, we're going to start asking our panelists questions. And I think the first question, just across the board, maybe we'll start with you, Borough President Levine, is to speak about the role that data transparency and access to information plays in your work today. And I'm just going to put the footnote here that we are honored to have among our speakers my predecessor, Ronnie Lowenstein. And so when I ask you, Ronnie, I'm asking you in your capacity as the former director of the IBO, because I know right now your capacity is head grandmother. So data transparency may be important, but anyway. Mark, can you speak to this?
First of all, thank you, Louisa, for putting this together. Feel like in the wake of the, well, I can call it a catastrophe. You're technically a 501c3. In the wake of the catastrophe from Tuesday, local government is going to matter more than ever. And the IBO is critical to good government locally. We need you now more than ever. Thank you. And I'm very excited for this panel. I feel outclassed here to be with all these experts. It's nice to be in a room where the CAFA provision of the 1989 charter is considered to be exciting. Wow. I can think of no aspect of city government that couldn't be improved by smart use of data. And that doesn't just apply to the more obvious areas like traffic and transportation, but I would apply that to departments like housing and parks, certainly public health, fire response, education. And we've made enormous progress thanks to the reforms you're celebrating tonight. There's a lot more work to do that I'll be saying a word or two more about. But to all of you who have fought for the data transparency we have today, for the open data laws that the city has in place, which are better than many other jurisdictions in the world, thank you for that because they have been essential to my ability to serve the borough of Manhattan.
Thank you. Denora, perhaps you could speak particularly because you have bridged various parts, both inside government and now with youth.
Hi, everyone. I'm Denora Gattaccio. Nice to be here with you all and to be in the room and have the ability to embrace my true self, which is a democracy lawyer and a wonk. And so it's great to be able to be here and think about what's at stake, but also how to bridge that from Gen X, where I sit, right? And I started my career actually fresh out of law school, working at the city council 20 something years ago. And at the time, right, the notion of being the legislative attorney for the Governmental Operations Committee felt like the wonkiest thing I could do on earth, right? And like digging deep in the charter and thinking about back then, right? Like binders, like people would come to government hearings and they still do in some respects with binders of information. And we were all, even as lawyers, trying to figure out where to find that information, how to hold elected officials in government accountable, right, for the promises they've made to their constituents. And then we fast forward to where we are now, right, where we have digital native young people who've come of age, right, in this moment and everything they do. And now as a result for all of us, so much of what we do is online. So it's not the pager, right? It's in the palm of our hands, getting access to information. And yet still some of that feels like it is not accessible enough, right? So I remember back then going to the charter, trying to figure out where's the specific provision? How do we get access to the information that's required in the charter or in the administrative code to be able to hold city agencies accountable, and having a struggle to find it then. And now we have all of that information, and yet it still doesn't feel as proximate for young people. And when we think about how those demographics have shifted, again, we have digital native young people who everything they do is online. So we have an electorate now, even that reflects, or soon will reflect, a majority of young people versus those who were born in the 70s or before. And so even the way we think about how you access information, how do you have conversations online, right, and crowdsource that information and have conversations with your elected officials about it has drastically changed. And the pressure was put on us to be the upbeat panel, right, at the end of the day to close it out. And so what's exciting about that is that means we have to have, even in this moment, I'm going to speak in a nonpartisan voice, given my own C3 status as running a nonprofit. But young people are craving that access information. And what we've been pushing them to do at Do Something, the Hub for Youth-Centered activism and impact, is to then make sure it isn't just about the singular act of going to vote on election day, or for some young people who didn't go vote on election day. It's the more important part of how do you hold your elected officials accountable post-election, right? We don't coronate leaders in America. And so we have to hold them accountable, and being able to have access to the governing texts that hold them accountable is the key. And so for us, it's the city has taken, leaps and bounds steps forward in digitizing and having access to information. And yet for young people, I Googled, just even as I was preparing for today, city charter online, right? And does the first hit that come up, is that the actual city charter? No, right? And so how do we actually make sure that the text is accurate? It's not a 2004 version of the city charter, because that's actually the first hit that comes up. And then how do you have the current version of that available in a way that allows a young person who's sitting in a room like this, might want to ask a pertinent question, to come to the fore and say, in the 10 seconds they're going to take to spend their time thinking about this, oh, I found the charter and I know what to ask. And so while there's been progress made, and substantial progress made, I think even in this moment, there is an exciting opportunity to do more to meet the needs of a younger and more dynamically engaged generation of voters and citizens, if you will.
Donna, so Donna, obviously we're interested in the role of data at the NYCLU. Public Advocate Williams told us earlier today that facts are coming back. Okay. So and he said that in the context of the recent era of low facts. So it would be very interesting to hear particularly data and facts from the perspective of you and your organization.
Yeah. Thank you. What I have to say to Jumaane Williams is, you could fool me, but whatever, in terms of facts coming back. Anyway, I think we're in an era where we're going to hear a lot of anything but. But I do agree that, and it does feel a little oxymoronic to say this, that data is a powerful tool for good, or at least it can be. But saying that More data is a good thing. Just think of all the crap we all get in our inboxes on social media that we don't want, the echo chambers that we're living in. But it's also important, I think, to say that, data is good if it's used right, and it can be misused for bad ends. It can be cherry picked. We all know that. So the fault may not be in the data sometimes, but in the people who are using it. Just saying. Before I talk about sort of how the IBO has been instrumental in helping the New York Civil Liberties Union do good with data, I just want to go back to something that most of you have heard about probably, which is stop and frisk. We fought after the murder of Sean Bell for access to the stop and frisk data of the NYPD. And without going into that battle, it was that data about the number of stops and frisks, about the demographic of who was stopped and frisked, and the outcome of stop and frisk that we got from the NYPD, not without an enormous amount of foiling and litigating. We made a lot of attorney's fees out of the city's intransigence and refusal to give us information, even though there was a law requiring that they do. And I firmly believe that it was that data about the racial disparities in stop and frisk and the ridiculously low numbers in achieving what it was designed for, or what it was pitched to us for, which was supposedly to recover weapons. And you're going to have to forgive me if I get the decimal point wrong, but it was either 0.001 or 0.001% of stop and frisks that resulted in the legitimate purpose, supposedly, of stop and frisk, which was the recovery of a weapon. So, and it was the fact that 8-to-1 was the ratio of blacks to whites being stopped and frisked in New York City, also with an even lower hit rate. So data is important. I want to share with you that one of the times when I was asked to address the National Action Network conference, I chose as my topic data. So I'm with you guys. So I just want to share a few examples of how the IBO has been helpful to the NYCLU. I hope this isn't sealing your fate, now you'll be out of the budget for the next, whatever, the rest of this administration. But in helping us, untangle what's really going on. They say follow the money. I think it's, what we learned about IBO is that, yes, you follow the money. You're prepared to explain it to ordinary people in plain language. That's great. But you also follow other data that doesn't necessarily have a dollar sign on it. And so when we were trying to figure out, and this is parallel to our stop and frisk work, what on earth was going on in the New York City public schools with regard to the NYPD arresting kids back maybe 15 years ago. 15 years ago. We were getting complaints of kids getting arrested in school, teachers getting arrested in school, the NYPD being in schools. We knew that Giuliani, remember him? That disgraced guy. Oh, I wonder what position he's in again. Anyway, he convinced the Board of Ed, or the Board of Ed at the time, to transfer responsibility for school safety from the Board of Education to the police department. He used not data, but crime is up, and use data in the sense of withholding the data that in fact crime was actually down that year in the city schools to convince them to do it. They did it. And he said, but don't worry, we're not going to arrest people. We would never arrest kids in schools. Don't be ridiculous. So we're getting complaints that kids are getting arrested in schools. We were fighting for information about like how many kids, what's the demographic. It actually mirrored exactly stop and frisk, 8-to-1, white, black to white, Hispanics, 4-to-1, Hispanic to white. It was like remarkable. And we lobbied and succeeded in getting past the Student Safety Act, which required the city to report the data on school arrests and suspension. And that was a great victory. And we had to negotiate every little detail of this legislation, including the scope of it in terms of who had to, what data had to be reported. And the mayor's office and the city council insisted, maybe it was just the city council, insisted that we only cover the school safety division of the police department. And we said, well, we want the whole thing. This is all you need. This is all you need. It's all we're going to give you. We said, okay, it was passed. Great. We started getting data. And then we found out that we weren't getting all the data. We went to the IBO and asked for like, how does that happen? You know, we didn't even know like where the school safety division fit. Does anybody else do school safety? Anybody else? We had no clue. IBO helped us. I'm sorry if I'm hurting your future budget, but they really helped us understand the very transparent infrastructure around school safety and underlying arrests in schools. And we learned that the number of arrests that was reported pursuant to the Student Safety Act excluded 75% of the arrests that went on in schools. Why? Because the school safety division, which the act was limited to, only rarely did arrests. It was the NYPD precincts that were called in various incidents that did the arresting. So like we had won this huge victory. We celebrated a victory for transparency and equality and all that stuff. And it turned out that it was like an empty victory. Thanks to the IBO's help on that, we were able to lobby for an amendment to it to cover the entire police department. So that's just like one example. And I just want to say a public thank you right. Well, actually, yeah, I don't think you were there. I think, I don't know if it was before your time or after, but or during. It was. You see, she's taking credit because she's a grandma like me, except I'm not on full-time duty yet. So anyway, I'll stop. I have lots more to say, but I think I should just shut up for now. Right. Okay.
Oh, Commissioner Toole. As DORIS Commissioner, obviously, as the Department of Records and Information Services inside government DORIS, I would imagine that your day-to-day is deeply immersed in data. But could you also speak about some of the innovative pluses and minuses that you see as the leader of that agency?
I would be delighted to, but first I want to tell Donna that you don't have to be concerned about the IBO's budget because the Charter Revision Commission baked the formula into it and their funding is always guaranteed. So say what you want. All right.
I'm always learning from you guys. Thank you.
So yeah, at DORIS, the Department of Records and Information Services, we hold, protect, and make available city government's records. The records date to the 1600s and they go through the present. And basically, in my tenure, I've been there since 2014, I have looked at the records in two ways. One is filling a void. So upon arrival, it became clear that there are areas where the city needs to provide more information, make it publicly accessible and easily attained. So one example would be we built what's called Open Records, the city's unified Freedom of Information Law portal, where you can submit a FOIL request to the agencies of the city and track its responsiveness online and get, depending on what the response is, if it's personal data, not going to go up on the portal, But if it isn't, it goes on to the portal. And so most city agencies are getting their FOIL requests through that. And it makes it easy. It makes it transparent. So we need to do some things differently and continue to improve it. But it really was a giant step forward because before that, you would never know what happened to your FOIL request at any agency. It just sort of went off into the ether. So that's one area filling the void. Another example is what's called the Government Publications Portal. There is local law that requires every city agency to provide their reports, any publication within 10 days of issuance to the library and make it available. In 2014, if you typed one thing wrong, if you typed budgets with an S as opposed to budget, you would not find a document. So we upgraded the coding for the portal to make it really like intuitive. So it's really easy. If you misspell budget, you're probably going to get what you need. And so agencies are submitting their records. Not everyone does that. And part of our effort around that data is really working with our agency partners to make this online library the biggest and best it can be. So you can find the reports from borough presidents and the city council and all city agencies. And the other area where we really work on data is actually getting rid of data. Now, don't worry, this is really important. So one of there are three divisions in my agency: the municipal library and the municipal archives, which are about preserving, protecting, and making available data. The other part is records management. And so what I learned, because I hadn't given this much thought before I got to DORIS, what I've learned since is that as we pivoted from the paper age to the digital age, and we have all the born digital people doing things, including many members of government, we have amassed a real mess. So the Office of Technology and Innovation holds a lot of records for city agencies. There are some city agencies that hold their own, but they hold the bulk of them. They have a little over 11 petabytes of city agency data. Now, technologists know that that is a lot. But for people who aren't technologists, what that is about 5.5, so 5.5 trillion pieces of paper. 1 trillion pieces of paper would be 678 miles tall. So it's the amount of data that they're holding is incredible. And the problem with that is that if you have too much data, you can't find anything. And no one has managed this data. So there are all kinds of records. It's both structured and unstructured data. But because no one's managed it, it just sits there and it costs money. And so what we have done in our records management division is deploy a software solution that can help agencies apply their retention schedules without getting too much in the weeds. That's how long each kind of record should be held to this electronic data to begin to whittle it down in a way that agencies can manage what they're getting rid of, manage what they're retaining, reduce the carbon footprint, reduce the financial footprint for the city. So for us, data is really important. We call it records generally, but it is the same thing. And we are both keeping it and hoping to get rid of it.
Ronnie, as you and I know, and many of you who have read the charter know, the IBO chapter in the charter speaks to the commitment that if the director of the IBO requests for a city data set, unless it's personally identifying information, the city is obliged to turn it over. Now, we know how successful that is, and you'll notice there's no time frame in there, so there's some challenges. But the reality is, IBO has access to data in a way that very few other entities, even within government, do. So my question to you, all jokes aside, is access to data enough?
No, obviously not. The charter gives us very strong access to data. But when we first started up, we couldn't even get publicly available data out of the mayor's office of management and budget. And so we were in the embarrassing position of having data analysts, call from their home phones and say, "Hi, I live in Bensonhurst, and I please get this and that and the next thing. To say it was rocky with an understatement. We benefited greatly from a suit, or they finally brought suit against the Giuliani administration and won a very strong judgment that allowed us to get data pretty much in any possible form. As a matter of fact, we had specified what forms we wanted the data to be in. And the ruling that came back actually said, and in the future, when there are other new kinds of data available, they should be available to you as well. So that was important. I think it was also important that over time, agencies got used to dealing with IBO as we became more established and people understood what we were trying to do. Even if you didn't exactly like the fact that we were calling your agency, because the call from IBO is rarely good news, they got used to working with you. And so that made access easier and easier over time. Like anything else, there are snags. You have to know that the data is out there. And as we've over time had more people who've been in various city agencies, we've gotten a lot more sophisticated about knowing exactly what other offices have. But having said all that, the data itself is not sufficient. Coming out of the city's fiscal crisis in the 70s, the city's budget process, which is the same process they're still using now, was built for control. They weren't worried about access to information. They were worried about staying in balance. They were worried about knowing how much money they actually were spending and how much they had. And they built documents that produced reams of data that only work if you know how to decipher them. So it's not just that you need the data. I mean, even under the city's current budgets, there's huge quantities of data, but you need to know how to use the data and what the nuances of the data are. And very often that's what a place like IBO will do for you.
So thank you. So we've heard the strength of access to data, and the importance of real data, open data. We've heard the challenges of understanding what is real and accurate data, particularly for younger folks who navigate, through the web or, who use their devices. We've heard about the challenges of getting data and the obstruction that can occur. We've had 678 miles of vertical data and how to get rid of it. But the importance of collecting the important data and getting rid of the junk, if you will, or the obsolete, and also recognizing that a great deal of what the city puts forth as data is really deeply challenging to understand in the format in the version it's put out. So I want to take a step back and think a little bit about, here we are in November post-election. And I want to ask you, Borough President, about some of the challenges that you might see with the general commitment to transparency and to more access to data. As New York City, do you also see that there are potential risks to this transparency in the current era?
Well, unambiguously, I want more data transparency because it's a way to ensure good governance, and it can be an incredible tool for policymakers and for regular citizens. And there's lots of ways we have to make it easier for regular New Yorkers to access that data. But I will say, in an era where we have potential hostile forces in Washington, I do worry about people with bad intentions accessing that data and distorting it. And maybe it could be twisting data on migrants or public safety statistics or learning differences. And I don't have an answer here because closing the door on access to data shouldn't be our response. But it's not too soon to start thinking about how to avoid this kind of information being used for damaging purposes. I expect it will come. And in fact, we've already seen a pretty aggressive effort to get information on migrants by a Republican Congress member from New York City. And the purpose there was to get on Fox News and take a swipe at people coming to New York. And that could just be a preview of what awaits us when we have the White House, the Senate, and potentially Congress in the hands of a party that doesn't believe in some of our values and principles here in New York City. Was this supposed to be the uplifting panel? You want to ask me a different question? Sorry.
We'll ask you about AI, but.
Okay. I'll be uplifting when you get to that.
Denora and Donna, you both look at, you both of your constituencies, I'm sure, are very potentially thinking about how to get information and what is accurate information. And I'd be interested, I think we'd all be interested in hearing about what you think are, particularly in this era of more government, more local transparency, a commitment to understanding more. How do you help your, in effect, constituents or your, people who tap into your services understand more of what is real and accurate? Denora, you gave the example of Googling charter. How do you as an organization help your folks sort out what are they actually looking for and at?
Well, I think we have to acknowledge the reality of what we're talking about when we think about Gen Z and Gen Alpha, right? So those are people who were born in the 1990s and 2000s, right? And they are a growing segment of our population, and as I noted, are digital natives. So everything they're thinking about is like how to get it in the 72 seconds it might take them to search it online versus, for example, the 72 years it took from the convention in Seneca Falls to the 19th Amendment, right? It's like, can I get it instantly? And then how do I process that, right? So a lot of keyword searching and trying to find Google the answer, if you will. I have a soon-to-be 14-year-old daughter, and when we first got her a phone, she's gonna be so embarrassed if she ever hears I said this in a room full of people, but when we first got her a phone, we were sitting in the car and I don't even remember what we were talking about. And she literally Googled the answer, right? And we called her Googleicious. And we're like, Googleicious, put the phone down. Let's have a conversation on the merits about how do you find information? How do you find trustworthy information? And how do you test the veracity of that information? And so what I would say with all of that context in mind is that digital native young people actually distrust government at record levels. So right, for us at Do Something, we're starting with the proposition that I want to be positive too. Sorry. I'm going to be a realist for a minute. How do we get young people to actually trust government and then to say that that's the place in the repository they're going to go to for information and then use that information to propose solutions? Because we have young people who are going to gig their way to solutions, and they're often thinking how to take the little bit of information they have and build a new solution as opposed to tapping into government to scale solutions, which was the point of government, and to be able to get to impact at scale. And so when we talk to young people, especially in this post-election climate, we're also being very clear with them about the role that local government plays in their lives, as opposed to how much emphasis and energy is placed every 2 to 4 years on what happens at the federal level. And so when we talk to young people, we say all change is starting and happening for them locally. And that this notion of even starting off with the micro action you can take and using, a problem in your community and then turning your volunteerism into that build up or successive action towards deeper impact is how we orient young people to beginning to be change makers and to begin to be leaders at the civic level. And so that for me is like first and foremost of understanding who are your local elected officials, what are the local governing texts, how do you access those local hearings, et cetera, where you can get information to be able to do the work you do in a positive frame, right? So young people know all of the issues that are plaguing themselves in their communities and will tell us about them all day. And they have micro solutions as well as macro solutions to how to address them. We are directing them then to tap into local government for how they solve those problems, not just individually, because I think that's part of the challenge is we all have created our own silos where if, the person sitting next to me who's Donna, who's someone whose values I share, she's not though someone whose values I share. I can cancel Donna. I don't have to be in community with her. I don't have to work through problems. And often we are making sure young people understand that it is because if Donna and I share differences of opinion, that's how you're going to get to better solutions. And then understanding then within those confines of local government, then how do you take actions, both again at the volunteer level and then level that up towards more systemic policy change. So we're looking at young people and we're asking them to both understand what's at stake, but also then start small, start local, and then build that up successively.
honestly, the main constituent entity that we deal with and try to understand data, helping to understand data, is the MICLU as an institution. We are constantly foiling government to get data on a variety of government functions. And, this reminds me of, one of the stop and frisk lawsuits we had to file back in the day when we first started getting the stop and frisk data from the NYPD, and we had to foil it every time to the city council because they had to report it to the city council. And the city council didn't want to be accused of like giving us stuff without, and it was ridiculous. But Chris Dunn, my colleague, could be seen, leaving City Hall or 250 Broadway with like this much paper. It's not quite, 685 miles or whatever the number is. I'm not too good with numbers. But it was a stack. And Chris and I would, just spend hours like looking through precinct by precinct and offense by offense and suspected offense and circumstance, street. And then we learned that they had it all electronically. And they weren't giving it to us. I mean, we had a fun little cottage industry. It was gratifying to do the arithmetic, and I was very good in arithmetic that time. But when we asked for it electronically, they said no. So going to your point, Ronnie, you had your lawsuit. We had our lawsuit as well, which we were not at all sure we were going to win. But when they ordered the city to provide data electronically, it was a big deal and gave us a lot of support. But, the other piece of this that I want to mention, is the secrecy that's built into a lot of how we get our information. And, the Childhood Internet Protection Act, well, there's a provision of that actually prohibits journalists or individual members of the public from using electronic tools, technology to figure out the algorithms that are being used by social media companies in driving us to various places and driving information to us. So, trade secrets or whatever it is, federal law makes it harder for us. If you believe that knowledge is power, then knowing the algorithms they use and how they're manipulating us would be power. I think you need a lot more than knowledge for power over that. But it's actually illegal to use technology to try to figure out what the algorithms are. And I think that's like a big deal and should be reformed, but I don't have high hopes for the next.
I'm going to shift a little bit. Pauline, in 1989, and building on the 87 and 88 Dick Ravitch-led charter revision commissions. So 89 and earlier covered a broad range of topics while also working to ensure input from across the city. So prior to being a commissioner, you were once outside government. Can you speak to not just the 89 charter revisions, but also other changes that tried to tackle the need for government transparency?
Sure. Both of those, I was on the staff of both of those charter revision commissions and the communications and community outreach division. And, as Gretchen attested earlier today, they held an extraordinary number of hearings and meetings. And at these events, I mean, both starting with Ravitch and then going on under Fritz Schwartz leadership, the commission, which retained a lot of its members in both iterations, they decided they wanted to get people's opinions in a way that I don't think had happened in city government for a very, very long time. And so as people testified, they would reach out to people who had views that they might not agree with and brought those views to the table. And they held a number of public hearings and people came up and they said, we should have an independent budget office. We should have a conflict of interest board that actually has teeth and where there are ethics rules that you can see what they are and you could hold people accountable. There should be a conflict of interest board that can sort of hold the feet to the fire. There should be CAPA, which actually came out of the Ravitch commission, which was the Citywide Administrative Procedures Act around rulemaking. We need to make that tight. We need to let the public know when there are going to be rule changes, right? Those things came out of that. And then like enshrining campaign finance in the 1988 charter revision. As it was huge because then it couldn't be touched, right? Then it sort of gave, leveled the playing field and gave people an opportunity to make their small contributions mean a lot more and affect change. The Voter Assistance Commission, same thing. How do you push information out to people so that they know what's going on in multiple languages so voting is accessible? And something that was also there, the infrastructure maintenance, this requirement that capital projects in the city had to be evaluated and rated and funding had to be directed to them if they were going to be at risk of failing in the near future. I mean, that was a huge reform that I don't think has been fully implemented. But those reforms came to the commission because of advocates. And sort of this morning, a lot of people gave a shout out to Gene Rushenoff, to whom I'm married. And he absolutely did a great job. I have nothing against that. But I also want to say there are these two women from Queens who, Pat Dolan was one of them. I don't remember the other person's name. They were so incensed because the Board of Estimate wanted to put a race in the park, Flushing Meadow Park, and they couldn't stand it. And they were there at every meeting saying they needed more community input into land use decision-making. The equity and justice people, Esmeralda Simmons, Margaret Fum, they all were involved in shaping what the outcome was and creating what I think is a set of rules, that's what a charter is, a set of principles and rules that, if applied correctly, give people great access to government. But if abandoned or if ignored, just keep existing power structures in place. And so the ballot, the challenge, I think, is using that document to really push for change within government and from without. That is helpful.
Borough President, you are obviously also as a borough president, have the island of Manhattan as your constituents, and prior to that, were in the city council. The changes that Pauline just highlighted and that have been talked about today repeatedly, are they effective tools for you to navigate, to understand what's going on within the government process and to transmit that to your constituents, or do you see room for improvement? And if so, how?
They were both a massive step forward, and they still leave more work to do. I think changes that you guys implemented gave birth to a whole new movement in New York City. Civic activists who are using data to understand policy and change policy. And Beta NYC is a shining example of that, which is housed in the Manhattan Borough President's office. And they have again and again and again gone into the guts of city data to tell really powerful stories. And we use it constantly in our policy work. We sometimes run into walls, though. We're currently battling the rise of so-called ghost plates, which are obscured or outright fraudulent license plates that people use to evade tolls at red light cameras, etc. And I guess because MTA owns a lot of the data, we can't get access to it. We currently have congestion pricing gantries already up, taking pictures. We can't get data on what they've read or not read in recent months. So maybe that's because this law doesn't apply to state authorities, but there are certainly areas which are obscure. I think where the biggest challenge comes is in regular members of the public accessing this data without the need to go through their borough president's office or Beta NYC. And a lot of it does require professionals. It's very hard for a regular New Yorker to answer the question, are rat complaints to 311 going up or down in my neighborhood? Or are fire and police response times going up or down in my neighborhood? It's very, very hard for them to get public health data without either data science ability or inside knowledge of how to access this. That problem is solved out in the world beyond government. You know, if you log in to check your mutual fund, you can easily get all manner of beautiful charts and data very easy without having any technical background. You make a post on Instagram, you can very easily get all sorts of cool charts about who's accessing it, when and how over time. We don't have that for city government data, and we should. And I hope those of you who are thinking about this make accessibility to the broader public your next priority. Was that uplifting? Maybe a little bit, not quite. Getting closer in the right direction.
Ronnie, a huge part of the IBO beyond the mandated reports has been getting access or interpretation of data to the public, taking data, analyzing it, understanding whatever the question to the answer is. Can you speak about some of over the 20 years that you led the agency, how that thought process evolved and how the sort of breadth of reporting evolved, because that's such a huge part of more people understanding what the IBO could do and the information it would provide?
I think of the best way to answer that. The breadth of what we did grew over time. In a sense, it was supply created its own demand. So some of our earliest work, for example, was on property taxes and the inequity in city's property tax system. There's almost nothing good you can say about it. But up until then, it was very hard to quantify the extent to which somebody living in Mill Basin was at a disadvantage compared with somebody living on Fifth Avenue, for example, in terms of the property taxes they had to pay. Once we started putting that information out, and we kept putting it out and putting it out, and I'm sure Avio is still putting it out, it created a demand for more of it, which IBO has supplied over time. We chose not to make a recommendation there any more than we chose to make recommendations elsewhere. But it's very clear looking at the information, you know, that it's an issue, that the system is grossly unfair and needs to be dealt with. So it wasn't that IBO had to go out and say, well, you need to reform the property tax. We brought everybody else to the point where they said, oh God, we've got to do something about the property tax, although, you know, doing it has proved incredibly difficult. Lead paint. I mean, I'm just thinking about different places, stadiums, places where we did early work, often at the request of elected officials, since we're charged with answering the questions of elected officials other than the mayor, primarily who we serve. And as we did that, and everything we do gets published, typically on IBO's own website, that begets more questions, often, you know, from the general public or advocacy organizations and so on and so forth. So the greater diversity of what we put out, the more questions we would get. Not that we could do all of the questions, but where we could, and where we thought there was citywide value in them, that's what we did. And it basically built over time.
All right. So I think we've learned a lot about how people come to you for data, how you professionally use data, where there's shortfalls and challenges. I think we're going to pivot to see if there are any questions from the audience. and we have a reception ahead of us. So they're cookies. Okay. Any questions? Please come to the mic and be attuned to the stairs. Thank you.
Hi, good afternoon, and thank you. I'm David Bloomfield. I say this with love. Maybe the IBO has outlived its usefulness in the sense that what people have been talking about is, to some degree, the restriction of the IBO as a budget office. And the need seems so much greater. So I'm wondering, as an anniversary gift, whether for the IBO and the people of the city of New York, we should expand the IBO's jurisdiction to be a general accountability office, not limited to budget, but to program analysis. Ronnie knows that during the amendment of one of the mayoral control statutes, we kind of snuck in the idea that for education, the IBO has responsibility for program analysis as well as budget. And I think we should expand that responsibility so that we can get all sorts of data, not just, and we kind of pussyfoot around it a little bit to expand it, to think that sort of everything is budget, but everything is not budget. And so anyway, what do you think about the idea of expanding the role of the IBO into more of a general accountability office? I did Google General Accountability Office, which is the US government version. That's what the GAO does. So we used one federal model for the IBO, the Congressional Budget Office. So I'm thinking time for a General Accountability Office. Thank you.
I'm really glad you asked that. It's amazing what you can actually drive through abroad. Does it have any impact on revenues or spending? Is there anything in life that doesn't have anything to do with revenues and spending? Lead paint. I mean, think of things. Defunding the police, that's an obvious. Ultimately, we've never had any difficulty finding, we call them hooks. I'm really glad you brought up the education work in particular. And when our purview over education was expanded on the resources we got to do it were expanded as well. City resources were expanded as well. It was kind of different from everything else we were doing because the Department of Ed, as you well know, puts out huge quantities of data. They sit on stores of data. But at the time, the Bloomberg administration, I guess, was making the case that what they were doing was making each cohort of students do better than the last. So this year's third graders are going to do even better in fourth grade next year because of what we're doing with them or to them or something.
It's also not a city agency, so they were blocking it.
Right. But I think there was a general feeling that people couldn't trust the information that was being released by the Department of Education. And that's why our work in that field was expanded. And ironically, and Sarita could speak to this way better than I could, it was more that they were cherry picking the information, surprise, than in fact lying about the information. Although they couldn't actually do the sort of analysis they were trying to do with the data they had, but that's a more sophisticated question. So I'd be curious to hear, what, and I followed GAO. They did wonderful work. What sorts of things that they're doing that we might not be able to do under our own charge?
Thank you.
Thank you.
Speaking of education, Sarita.
Thank you. Sarita Subramanian. I'm a senior research and strategy officer at IBO. So one thing that we have been thinking a lot more about is, and we've talked about this throughout the day, is meeting New Yorkers where they're at, going out to communities, and a large part of that is language access. And I think that goes hand in hand also with data giving power. And so we're trying to do more in terms of translating our written work product, but I'd be curious to hear about what efforts, engagement efforts in communities we can do to reach out to, different, communities that speak different languages. We have some ability on our staff, but not nearly as much as we need to. So what are the types of strategies that you use to engage in different communities with in different languages?
Pauline or
Okay,
Borough President?
sure. We have made a lot of progress on language access in New York City. We have a long way to go, particularly on emerging languages. We're strongest on Spanish, and there's still work to do. But there are hundreds of languages spoken in New York City, often for indigenous languages. There's no access. But honestly, even languages beyond Spanish in our migrant services, it's been very hard for French speakers to get service, which is an underappreciated and large portion. I think that technology can offer some help here. Translation technology is advanced at an extraordinary pace. If you haven't seen what it can do even in the last 6 months, we're in a whole new world now. There's no reason why community board meetings shouldn't be streamed in any language that the listener wishes. There's no reason why community board transcripts, or honestly any document, shouldn't be available in any language that the reader wishes. There's no reason why you shouldn't be able to apply for food stamps in New York City from your smartphone, not just in plain English, but in plain any language. And I think we've barely tapped the potential of technology. One more way in which we need an update from this era that you described in the 80s and 90s, when we couldn't dream of the kind of capabilities that we have today.
Thank you.
What I was going to say is that every agency in the city has a language access plan. And for the past, I would say 12 to 14 years, the city agencies are actually being held more accountable and fulfilling the requirement to provide their content to the public in the 10 major languages spoken within the city. It's far from perfect, but in the last several years, there's really been an emphasis on that. And so every agency website needs to provide Google Translate, different services to get information to people in their language. And then the other thing I would say is that the city's Civic Engagement Commission, which was created by a more recent charter revision commission, really does great work trying to bridge the information gap between government and all of government and communities. And they do multilingual trainings. They do all sorts of community engagements. And that would be another avenue to pursue.
And just two things. Pauline, I've known Gene Rushinoff for many years. It was like Eric Bischoff with around the NWO. If I met you years ago. And my question is, can Eric Adams, Joseph Biden, Kathy Hochul, and Donald Trump, aka the Mod Squad, expand this office? And if so, how, when, how, and when? Forget where, just how and when. Can they expand it? And if so, how and when? How long would it take?
I believe the only way the Independent Budget Office could be expanded would be through charter revision. And so that could be Mayor Adams. But I'm going to hazard a guess that if Mayor Adams returns to the charter revision forum soon, expanding the IBO will not be at the forefront of his priorities. One never knows, but I appreciate the vote of support.
Thank you. Just as out of curiosity, because I was told it is doing less when people are saying it should do more.
I think there's a difference between areas of responsibility. If you read the charter, it's extremely vague as to exactly what the IBO is meant to do. So we do a whole series of required reports. We have a wonderful website that lists reams of information that we've printed over the years. But part of the point of this 35th birthday is to also explore with all of you, what was that charter reform in 89 intending? And what is our part, IBO's part of those reforms, and how can we move those forward? So we appreciate your thinking and we hear you. Do a little more. We got it.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Only makes sense.
Jonathan Gilman. I'm interested in the discussion so far, but seem to be focusing on getting information out, getting it out to individuals, to nonprofits that can use that information, et cetera. And there's been this thin thread about reaching out to the community. And I wonder if, and this maybe for people outside this room, although maybe Denora might have some lead into this, whether we can use this information, whether this information can be used to further a civic culture, to have it played out in forums that are nonpartisan by the, let's say, the League of Women Voters, other nonprofits that reach into more diverse communities, to, get people to feel that this is part of their lives, not just that it's someone available for someone else to analyze it.
I appreciate that question. In response even to the language access question, I was like, should I weigh in? Because I do think it's also like, how do we get into classrooms and make sure as young people are grappling with solutions, right? So civics education in schools has seen a steady decline over the last several decades. Yes, we are feeling the pains of that, is the honest reality of this moment. And yet young people in New York State are required to take at least one semester of participation in government in order to graduate from high school. And in those courses, they are often talking about complex issues and how do you solve them? How do you engage directly with government data, law and policy to address those? And so one vehicle to make sure that IBO and its work is more accessible could be making sure, and I'm sure teachers are doing this across the state, but making sure that's a resource that's available to them. But it could be also in community board meetings, et cetera, where that information is being provided at scale. We do a lot of work through Do Something with young people to think about those concrete solutions to issues that are pressing to them. We're offering government resources like IBO to say, look here for the data and then unpack it. But even as we're bringing young people together at scale, they may not know even how to tap into the wealth, right? Because sometimes there's too much information. And so how do we, as the young people say, too long didn't read, right? So if it's too much information, did I not read it in order to get to the information I'm trying to find? And so I think there has to be this balance of making sure it's more accessible and it's a known quantity and entity, but then also making sure that the data that is most pressing is being put in the, almost being, put in the hands, if you will, of those who are trying to reach it.
Hi, my name is Lisa Rubin. Denora, it's good to see you from
I was like,
yeah, here I am. Hi. Thanks. So, I just wanted to follow up on the question about the role of IBO about possible expansion. And I know that we were talking earlier today about the Congressional Budget Office and how the IBO was somewhat modeled on it. But I'd like to note that in Congress, you also have an independent Congressional Research Service. We don't seem to have, which deals with issues beyond just budget. We don't seem to have that in the city level. I mean, at the city council, as a former staffer, I would help prepare reports, but I was preparing it under the direction of either the speaker or the council members. It wasn't really independent. And I would like to hope that whether it's through an expansion of the IBO or some new agency, that we start to get the equivalent. So if a council member really wants to get to the bottom of some pending bill, they can get some independent or a group, some independent source of information and perspective. That's it.
Yeah. Sure. Sounds like a good idea. Okay. All right. I thank you all. This has been a super informative, intense day with 4 panels. So I want to thank you. We do want to remind you that we have a reception on the 5th floor. But before we do that, I just want to offer another round of thank yous. First of all, to all of you for making it this far and for your incredible attention and questions. We really appreciate this opportunity to come together. We want to thank New York Law School for the amazing facilities, for co-sponsoring this with us. We want to thank Dean Crowell for his leadership and Ben Max from the Center on New York City and State Law. And the whole New York Law School team. And I also, again, want to thank Tina, who's done an amazing job. Tina is IBO's Chief Outreach and Engagement Officer. She came to me when I joined IBO with a brilliant plan, thinking we got to get to community. We got to figure out how to talk to more people. Let's have a birthday party. I know, we'll do it in an IBO way. We'll have a conference. So here we are. Thank you. And I just want to thank you all again. So now if you go to the lobby, there are IBO staff showing you how to get to the 5th floor where there are cookies and, I am told, not city government funded alcohol. So thank you.